This video was made in association with KnifeInformer.com. Head on over to Knife Informer for all of your blade-related needs, including reviews, comparisons, stats, and more. What is up, everybody, and welcome. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at this Herman Knives Custom Stinger. This knife comes to us on loan from my friend Mike. I'm very excited to be able to check out this knife. And this comes from a Polish maker, last name Herman. I'm not actually sure of the first name. It's very hard to find his information online. But this knife is a CNC'd masterpiece, quite frankly, and then, of course, hand-assembled and hand-finished by the maker. So this is just one guy pumping out knives over in Poland, and the quality level is pretty high. So let's go ahead and jump into it. Real quick, let's take a look at the stats. We'll get a size comparison going for you guys and check out the weight so that we have an idea of what we're working with, and then we'll jump into the features and flaws from there. Alright, so as you guys can see, the knife, it's got a pretty decent size. It's definitely longer than the Rat 2 and almost comes out to the PM2's length. It is beaten out by, I don't know, roughly 1/8 of an inch. You can see here that it is smaller than the PM2 in terms of frame size by a little bit, but the blade size is a little bit more... The cutting edge is actually longer than it is on the PM2. I don't know if I'm giving you a good angle of that, but overall the blade is actually going to be a little bit bigger in terms of useful cutting area. So ultimately going to be a pretty good size for EDC. I do have to say he didn't pack too much blade into this frame, so the proportions are a little bit off for me. Not to say that like the PM2 or anything does any better, but and off is the wrong word. It's still a pretty good blade, but you can see here the blade is definitely dwarfed by the overall size of the frame. It's mostly in this area here. Kind of comes up very far around the blade. But I don't want to focus too much on that. Let's go ahead and take a quick look at the weight as well. Okay, so let's place her down, and at 3.84 ounces, we are still in that excellent EDC range of about 3.5 to 4.5 ounces. It's definitely going to be on the lighter side, and we do have quite a bit of extensive internal milling going on inside this knife, and that is definitely going to be an aspect of where that weight reduction comes from. So let's go ahead and jump into the features and flaws. So the first thing that I'll talk about on this knife is that, you know, again, it is my first foray into Herman's knives. I'm just going to call him Herman for now, even though that's not his first name. So I really didn't know what to expect. This knife has a ton of high praises from the owner, however, and the owner has handled quite a bit of really fancy knives. So when he told me that this was on the way and that he was, you know, a really, really big fan of the knife and really excited for me to see it, you know, I had kind of high expectations. And it's not always good to have high expectations when jumping into a new knife. But that's fine. Let's go ahead and talk about some of the aspects of the knife that I found interesting. So first of all, you can see that there are some interesting aesthetic choices going on. So one, we have these screws that are hidden under the clip, and those are for the backspacer. And then these little dots here are actually the ends of screws, not pressed steel detent balls, as I had once thought. A lot of us have seen the ceramic detent balls being pressed into knives. It's kind of a cool, common aesthetic feature these days. And I thought that this was the same thing, but with, you know, just a silver material, perhaps titanium or something, or steel, obviously, as I already mentioned. That's actually not the case. I don't know if I can get a great angle here, but maybe you guys can see those two screws? On the other side, there's two dots. So that's really interesting because if you've ever taken apart a knife, you know that the tiny little screws used for the internals, especially with customs and stuff, are not very, well, they're not aesthetically pleasing. Let's just say that, right? They usually have kind of shaved ends off so that they can be resized to fit in the knife, and they're just usually pretty chopped off at the end. So to have these screws with these beautiful, polished, rounded ends and have them kind of be all the right length. Now, I will admit this center one is a little little pressed in, but to still have them be all visible and touchable like that is really impressive, quite frankly, and not something that I've seen on any other knife. It's not to say it's never been done, I'm sure it has, but I personally have never seen that before, so that's one point in terms of uniqueness that this maker is able to score from me. The next thing to talk about is this backspacer. I really like it, actually. You can see that there are some sort of like blue standoffs in between the backspacer, and I don't know, I guess those hold it in place to some extent with the screws. Because it's one screw all the way through, I see now. So you can see this final screw on the clip goes to this dot, and then these two screws under the clip go to these two dots, and they actually go all the way through the backspacer. So the way that the backspacer is kept centered as opposed to sliding around is with these spacers on either side. Now, I do really like the carving that he's done sort of in this area, and that the backspacer comes all the way up around to protect your finger from the tip. The clip on this knife is pretty interesting. You can see it's super large. It kind of reminds me of the Lee Williams kickstop that followers of the channel will have seen already in terms of its size. It has a lot of tension. It's a little nubby, but I have to say, because of the overall length of the clip, it actually goes in and out of the pocket very easily. One, maybe two hands going in, definitely one hand out. Super smooth clip, and so if you like the way it looks aesthetically, you could be sure that it'll function for you very well. I generally don't like clips that are super huge like this, just because I don't want that hanging out of my pocket, but that's all personal preference. You can also see that he's kind of cut away or milled away an area under the clip, and that gives a little bit more space for the material of your pants, which is always appreciated. So the next thing to talk about in terms of just kind of the aesthetics is this anodization job. So it's a little hard to see. It kind of looks like teal at first, but what we actually have in the shallow areas of these valleys or ridges is green. And then, of course, the tips and the clip and the tab lock and everything like that have all been done in sort of a very bright magenta. Now, the way he's done this, if my knowledge serves me correctly, is that he's, of course, anodized this whole thing green, and then he's just lightly gone back and taken away the green from the edges, and then lightly sort of tumbled these edges here as well, and sort of tumbled the whole thing. And so it's in these tiny little crevices and cracks from the tumbling, as well as all of the tips and edges, or edge highlights, as you might like to call them, have all been then done at a slightly lower voltage to get this magenta, of course green being the highest voltage color for anodization on titanium. So ultimately a really clean, really beautiful job, and I did see a secondary, or sort of an aftermarket anodizer recently on Instagram redo handles on a different stinger. It was actually a slightly different model, but it was the same milling pattern from Herman, and gosh, when these are polished, wow, the milling really comes to life. It's such a gorgeous knife. This tumbled finish, I really like the way it looks, and I think it was an impressive thing to do, but I don't think that the tumbled finish correctly accentuates the beautiful milling patterns that he's done, because it's actually very complex up in here. It's not just a simple shell pattern or anything like that. It's sort of one pattern going this way, another pattern going this way. It's all been done very cleanly, so that can be accented by a slightly different finishing job, although I still, again, think that this one is very impressive. One thing that I will mention is this custom pivot. I'm given to understand that it does come with the pivot tool. I believe that Mike has it, but he did not send that along, and I believe I've kind of flipped this knife a little bit loose, and there's no way for me to tighten it. So if it does come with the tool, great, but can we just get Torx already? Just give me Torx. So anyway, all these screws are Torx and everything, like, just let me take it apart with Torx, please. And I get it when they're, like, super crazy, or, like, just when the aesthetics of it are so good, but, like, 2 dots in a silver circle, come on. I mean, I could probably make this tool if I had to, but come on, just give me Torx at that rate. Generally, I think that the dots are actually on the presentation side. I don't know if Mike's chosen to flip those around, or if that's actually how they come, and I've just not been paying enough attention. But anyway, let's move on to the blade. Something that I've said on a few blades now is that I really like this crowned blade spine. This one's not quite as rounded off as, say, like the Chamois or the Grimsmo Rask or anything like that, but it is smoothed out a little bit, and that's something that I can appreciate. What we have is a full face flat grind, say that 5 times fast, and, you know, generally mild sort of belly here, ultimately coming to what is a flat cutting edge here. Pretty thin blade stock, gonna make an excellent slicer. We are looking at an acid wash finish, maybe a stone wash finish. We're going to call that a really, really heavy stone wash. There might be a little bit of acid etching going on there. Don't take my word for it. I'm no expert. But you can see we have a pretty useful blade shape. And then in terms of the ergonomics, this whole area here for the index finger is going to be great. You can see that we're getting help from the flipper tab in terms of sliding up. And then the rest of my hand comfortably wraps around the handle just like this. I do like that this area where the pinky is does have room for a bigger hand. You know, I could kind of fill this up more if I really had a chunkier hand, which is great. So don't worry about size. And then, of course, pinch grip is going to function pretty normally. Your hands grip this area very well. They're supported by this little point here. And then there is no jimping, so you're very slippery on this knife, I must admit, but still going to make an absolutely fine slicer as long as you're not... Well, actually, the angle is not too bad with the flipper tab. Usually with these knives, when you go in like this, you end up hitting the flipper tab, but I'm actually hitting my pinky first. So this should be able to slice all the way down to the cutting board now that I'm actually doing that in practice. So, you know, this knife is a tab lock. I'm not a fan of tab locks. I'd say that's my biggest pet peeve with it. This one functions great. Look, the action on this thing is sweet, and we're going to talk about that in just these next moments here, but... I'm just not a tab lock guy. I'm just going to leave it at that. I'm not going to say that one's better than the other because I don't want to get into that, but I'm not a tab lock guy, so that's a bit of a bummer. Now, this knife has a kind of an interesting sound. Because of the super hollowed out frame, or because of this super hollowed out frame, and sort of, you know, it's the thinner blade stock, it's not a super heavy knife as we saw before, you kind of get this really interesting, almost reverberating sort of hollow metallic sounds. Let's see if that comes across on the mic. Alright, so I don't know how much of that came across, but hopefully you get the picture. The knife has really, really great deployment. I have to say, the detent is tuned very well. The detent ball is fairly large. It protrudes a fair amount. It reminds me a lot of a Thorburn. It's even bigger than that, though. As you can see there. So, pretty significant detent, and that means that we do get really excellent deployment every time. I'm just going to kind of like lightly pull on the end of the flipper tab here. And I am holding the knife fairly sideways. And you can see how solid the deployment is. So I have to say, this has one of the most consistent deployments, especially with what is an otherwise maybe not the most useful flipper tab. It's a little bit small, it's a little bit pokey, there's no jimping. And even with all of those complaints to the flipper tab, I'm still getting this really fantastic, really solid, really rapid deployment. The consistency here with the deployment is probably my favorite thing. Really doesn't matter how much I tug on the tab or what angle or how I do it. It's coming out every single time. So that's really sweet. And then in terms of sort of dropping shut, it is very smooth, but I'm not sure that he was able to polish the detent track with the stone wash because it's very loud when it closes. Maybe you can hear it. And, you know, I'm not a big fan of when I can hear the knife kind of scraping along the detent track. It's not the greatest sound, so while it is incredibly smooth, I'll just let you guys see for yourselves how cleanly it drops shut on bearings. It's just pretty loud. Now, if this was my knife and I was able to disassemble it with the tool and everything, I would probably polish up that area a little bit and you know, play around with maybe adding, I don't know when the last time this was oiled or anything like that, although Mike did say it was fairly oiled. So I'd play around with like polishing up that area and seeing if I could maybe clean up some of the imperfections that are causing that noise. But I really have to say that I don't necessarily think all of that noise is just the detent track, but rather that the noise is actually amplified by the hollowness of the frame, because I can actually feel
the loudest parts of the noise I can actually feel vibrating through the frame. And I can actually hear the sound sort of coming from the frame versus only coming from this area. So it sounds like the sound is actually coming from the detent track, and then the sound waves are actually bouncing around inside of all the hollowed out spaces in the knife, and that's what's giving you that amplified sort of scraping sound. I don't think it's quite all in the track. So again, you can see that it's incredibly super smooth, super consistent. If you are thinking about, oh, I want a knife that's really fidgetable and that's got a great action, this is definitely one that you could buy. This is going to be super satisfying to anybody that's looking for that in a knife. So that's pretty much it, guys. Thanks so much for watching. This was an interesting introduction into Herman as a maker. I look forward to hopefully trying out newer models and other things in the future. Big thanks to Mike for sending this along. And of course, if you'd like to see beautiful pictures of this knife or any of these knives around the table, you can do so by following me on Instagram at tovarishworks. And if you'd like to hit me up for any reason, you can always do so by reaching me at tovarishworks@gmail.com. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and I will see you next time.